introduce a little bit this panel on the afternoon of that long day, at least for those who have attended the other two panels as well. And before introducing the speakers, let me just say something briefly on the theme of this this last panel, which started, like the idea of it started being created when we all met last year in June, as the event couldn't take place, the event that we actually planned for last year. We met in an informal way, and it was the four of us, Liene, Nada, and Lina, and we started sharing kind of our spontaneous associations with the theme of the Communist Hauntings, but also with our experiences that we were going through at the time of the pandemic, the very early stages of the pandemic. And this is how we started gathering certain personal images or archives that were both interlinked with the experiences we were going through in the present, but also which brought back some kind of images and scenes or themes from the socialist past, specifically in Yugoslavia, but also from other former communist places, but also kind of thinking about the meaning of the force or power of these kind of past ideas or past experiences for future projects, like how the archive that is brought to life through experiences in the present or through artistic interpretations of them can actually act out a new force in the present for creating new futures. So this is how the theme started emerging, the acting archives, the presence of the archival material, especially when it is being used in unusual constellations. And this is what our speakers will be talking about, more or less, in their different ways and from their different angles. I would like to then start with Nada Prlja, who will be the first speaker. She is a contemporary multimedia artist, and your work always kind of is very directed towards social life, very engaged with political narratives and events, and with this kind of idea of intervening directly in the political matter of today. And what you do is, I think this is what you might be talking about. You're kind of reviving certain archival communist relics and bring them directly to the matter of today. One of the works you will be talking about, the supervisions to read, was part of represented the pavilion of the Republic of North Macedonia on the Venice Biennial in 2019. So I think that was the same biennial like Igor Grubic's work. So it's also nice to have this connection. I hand it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I extended, of course, I will mention some of the works from the pavilion itself, but in a way, when I read your abstracts for the conference, and when I looked at it, for me, what was striking that actually you made this connection from our talks that we had a year ago between the past, between the time when Tito died and this new corona, kind of a space that we inhabit. And in a way, it was very inspirational for me to prepare this presentation, but by thinking about that, how we actually, at that time, we felt like living in some kind of doomsday, kind of underground, kind of in some threshold, and that actually, again, we are facing the same. And then when I started rethinking about my work, somehow I came to a point that actually there are quite few works that somehow emerge from that being in this like a threshold between the things. So somehow I wanted to somehow raise some of those issues and kind of refer to them through my presentation. So I will have to ask you now for if the screen could be shared with the presentation.
No problem.
And as it is video, if we can just stay for a second on the second image. So you will need a little bit to rewind. So if we can, yeah, just make it play and then stay on the second, if it's possible. If not, it's... Yes, so we can stay on this one for a second. Okay, so I will start with the exhibition which I created in 2019, this is exhibition which was actually after Venice Biennial, and it was called Aden in City of Fire. So it's somehow after the Venice Biennial made some kind of a like summary, or I was thinking of how I can basically create some retrospective, but not really retrospective, artistic, which would kind of talk about my work. But somehow I was much more interested in the fact that what I have somehow learned through this old time working as an artist. So one of the things that somehow came as a which was for me very important was the fact that we keep producing these physical things and that we kind of store them, throw them, but we just keep producing and producing. But at the same time, I even when I was part of Venice Biennale, I even witnessed that on a much larger scale, where a lot of materials were used and a lot of thrown and unused. And in a way, I just felt that somehow by being in the situation in which we were, even in 2019, we cannot really continue working like that longer as an artist, or just keep overproducing. So I tried through this exhibition somehow to look at the new ways how we can create as an artist, and also in order to represent how all these works of art which were part of this exhibition were produced, I created some kind of a graphic novel which actually gave introduction to how these artworks were created. So if we can just go a few more slides, and I will say stop when it needs to be stopped. Yeah. Okay, so if we can just, okay, if we can just stay here. Okay, it's fine. So it's basically that I said that there should be 3 ways of how we can create work from now, by referring to the works of art from our own works and works from the past. So one of them was borrow from the works of art by others, but not really borrow, but somehow talk about the works by others. And especially when I talked about that, was very much talk about the works of art which have somehow been forgotten, and that we, from this Yugoslav perspective, have erased from our history. So that kind of takes all this big section of time which represented socialist Yugoslavia. Of course, now there is a very different desire actually to analyze and to know, but until now we have just complete emptiness in terms of referring to those works. The second idea was to reuse. So I came there with the idea of reusing, either thinking about the past political systems, but also how we as an artist could somehow reuse our old artworks in order to create a new one, just in order to avoid use more materials. And then as a last one, I said we have to de-artify, which means we have to stop thinking about just creating artifacts and artworks, but also how we can basically find a way to interact or to become more somehow socially aware, and to find a ways how art can basically find a stronger connection with the society from which it grows out, let's say. So as to start this presentation, I have created this little creepy movie, which I'm so bad in reading, and I'm so bad I hate my voice and I don't like to do it, but because it's a graphic novel, so it contains image and text, I did not know how to present it otherwise. So we have this little movie, which is basically the beginning of this graphic novel, which is this Adan, which is my superhero alter ego, which somehow is trying to save the works of, is trying to save the world of art in order to become, and in order to somehow be able to function in the future, because in the way how it was functioning pre 2000, I mean, before Corona, it's not sustainable. So it is, what is quite eerie about this, you will listen to the text of this little video, and you will see actually that I'm talking about curfew, I'm talking about that on our land there are viruses, and all of this was written actually in November 2019, so it was before or as Corona was starting. So actually for me it was interesting to somehow to show how being in this kind of not knowing, but almost being or feeling that we are actually now in this threshold was represented through this little graphic novel / now this little video. So if we can just play this further.
La Biennale Venezia, year 2019. In the award-winning Lithuanian pavilion, even they sang about the climate change. And in the Danish pavilion, even though they talked about the end of the world, the amounts of goods, services, money, and materials used for the preparation of pavilions and exhibitions is somehow sickening to me. From Tronchetta, 7 watery kilometers away from Venice, back and forth. Trucks, cranes, boats, artwork stored away everywhere. Catalogs and building materials, used, unused, wasted everywhere. Artists, when are you going to change your mode of production? No one knew why, but we all knew that the end was near. Some people claimed that it was because of pollution. Others spoke of impending catastrophe and doom. But new holes in the ground connecting the old tunnels were dug every day in order to house humans. Our city was deemed uninhabitable. The hazy sky was an unlimited source of internet charge. The solar energy panels, satellite dishes, and cables provided the power for overpopulated underground. Everybody, including greed and inhumanity, were now living underground, beneath the earth, in the war shelters that were constructed during World War II. 51-inch plasma TV screens, Kirby vacuum cleaners, or smart fridges that memorize the expiry dates of consumable products were now just a pile of rubbish, not at all needed for survival in the underground. Most of the buildings remaining of the underground were turned into shopping malls. With an endless supply of unneeded items produced before the end of the times, commoners would go to shopping malls, now run by gang lords who had hijacked all material goods. Governmental institutions also remained above the ground, essentially selling all the goods that remained in the buildings, be it paper supplies, furniture, carpets, or something else. The gang lords could not repossess or steal governmental goods due to the codes ingrained in all products. We lived under the ground, trying to continue normally. The shiny beauty of the objects or computer screens no longer had any meaning. Boredom prevailed here. There was nothing to be liked in this time of hyper-capitalism. Makeup manufacturers are all bust, I thought to myself. Nevertheless, I should use up the last makeup pencils so they do not expire. I murmured to myself, while I drew 2 lines, stretching the corners of my mouth upwards. Joker, the perfect face for my new work. But what does the Joker have to do with art? I thought to myself. The nightmare persists. The name of Kazimir Malevich came to me. I transformed myself into the ground zero of form and emerged from nothing to something. Finally, Aden was here. This night was one of those. A special air balloon was pumped up around the Museum of Old Collection. The auction was on. Picasso's Head of Woman, which was given by artist himself, will be under the hammer for the first time. Masks, oxygen containers, and protective garments were off. The gang lords and other celebrities were enjoying strolling and chatting in the museum. Artwork displayed in security cages were like diamonds just to be harvested by those who see them just as investment. Everybody was looking their best while posing for selfies. This will be a memorable day, the day when beloved Picasso moved into the hands of one of the giants. How significance has become insignificant in this hellish dump. The auction started with the sale of important works by Christo and Manev. They were sold to Vaccination Lord and Quarantine Hostel Lord. They immediately announced curfew until tomorrow morning around the exit 3, as the works will be carried. The time was ticking. There was only 30 minutes to the curfew. I just hoped that the time will run out and that Picasso will never be sold. I jumped out of my bed without even finishing watching transmission. This world cannot survive with art in the lockdown. Where are you going, you crazy head? Curfew is just a few minutes away. I heard from somewhere inside of the house, but I did not reply. Nobody should know that I'm gone. I climbed over the ground. 5 minutes before the curfew, still rows of people using the fast internet. Their bodies are numb. Their masks and eyes are lit with the blue light from the screens. Visually enchanting, in any other way desperate. Close to the exit, a large group of children gathered together, powering the gaming industry and never communicating. Their bodies, arms, and legs are interwoven. The only way to remain safe from the gang's abduction. I tried not to think about it and started running toward the museum. I could not shake the words crazy head out of my mind. Am I a crazy head? Well, Picasso's woman head is gone forever. I spotted guards carrying Picasso's painting toward the exit 3. By flying in my drone, I could not stop thinking about the artworks that kept disappearing forever. It is not only the artworks. The archives are also off reach, limited only to the information from the click of the button of the internet. It is a fact that most of the artworks are not on the net. My rage echoed in the dark. Stone Head, sculpture by artist Jordan Grabulovsky made in the 60s, is another work on sale tonight. I shouted to the interior of my mask. I hope that I will arrive before the air balloon is removed and the museum is again alarmed. The sculpture is worth saving from hands of the nasty lords. When I arrived, the air balloon was almost deflated. Now I needed to jump to the museum balloon and to cut it open to enter the museum. And here it was, Grabulovsky's head, standing alone in the museum, proudly gazing at the space around it, waiting for tomorrow to be abducted to the harem of one of the lords. I grabbed it with my hands and pressed it against my body, and I disappeared into the darkness of the overground night. This is where I'm going to place it for now, in order to keep it for some better times. We have built this underground shelter as a safe place for all safekeeping artworks for the generations to come. Artist, still plural.
Thank you, Nada. We can't hear you. Are you?
I just mute myself. Can we? Okay, let's stop here because I said, can we stop the video? But doesn't matter. We can go from here. So basically, this was one of the attempts, and you can see that actually the gallery space or the exhibition space has become like this metaphorically space underground where we basically try to save the works of art or try to save the memory or archive something from the past. So this is in a way, of course, not it's just an association because the whole idea was actually to somehow bring those works of art from archives that are completely hidden and forgotten and have no reference, basically back to the eyes of the public. In the same way, we just jumped that, but I presume, can we just go maybe a little bit back? Okay, maybe, okay, if we play from here and then stop on the next picture. Yeah, perfect. Stop here. So basically in 2004, I created an artwork which was just a one-day a newspaper from one day, and with this big black boxes, I basically printed, not over, but I printed the newspaper where all these black boxes represented the commercial space in the actual newspaper. So, and then if you put them all together, you will really see that actual space for the news is really limited. So then and this was 2004. And then if you go to the next slide and again stop. Perfect. So yes, and then for creation of this new work in 2019, what I did was basically I repainted some of those newspapers with the new content, which is basically all the catastrophes that were the fire, the different basically ecological catastrophes that have happened since 2014, where the first work was made, and in order to basically present that the number of those has been increasing significantly in the last years. So if you can just play it and then stop on the red. And this is few images of how that actually appeared in the gallery, where you can see partially some of the old 2004 and then works of art which are basically related to the catastrophes that were happening. And then in the same way, in this idea of thinking of reusing our own artworks, I was also thinking about this recycling of political ideas. And in 2013, I started with a project which was called Subversion to Red. And this is Red Discussion. It's a part of that project, which actually looks back in the history and thinks about time of socialism, but time of socialism from a perspective that, I mean, many of you would know that in Yugoslavia, we just tried to completely erase that times. And then my desire was somehow to find and build on some of those moments that we could still basically build upon. So if we go to next slide and then again stop, and I presume I just have a few more minutes, so I won't keep you long. The goal of those artworks was basically to create this table. It was which is all written with the different notions or different ideas of what we could take from the Marxist theory and take it to today and develop on it. So for this 5 theorists or cultural workers have been invited to suggest two topics and which are still worth thinking of, and somehow to interact with the other present on the table, because it was a performative piece, to interact and somehow discuss those ideas. Of course, what is different in this process than being a just like, let's say, presentation or conference, is that there is a person who is sitting in the middle of this table, and then that person is making connections and suggestions, and because everything happens very naturally, the people are invited to somehow interact and to open up, and in a way this was also my comment on the fact that the idea that we need to use from a socialism is to somehow give this space to ideology, but also to find a way how to break that ideology by introducing a playfulness within it. So that's how this project emerged, and the first one was organized in a collaboration with Lina on kind invitation by her, but the people who took part were Mark Fisher, David Beach, Gail Day, Hannah Black, and Nina Power, and the moderator was Vlad Morariu. So if we now if we can play the next images, we can see here the participants of the second one, which were and we are seeing some of the images from the actual event, which was in a Venice biennial during the opening time, which was Maurizio Lazzaretto, Chantal Mouffe, Charles Sesche, Lara Raichkovic, Artan Sadiku, and the moderator was again Vlad Morariu. So very engaging and very, again, thinking about a different, for example, like recuperate the museum, demodernize, what do we do with the time, lack of time, and so on, bringing all those interesting ideas to the discussion. If we can just stop here, and I will just finish with this last artwork, which was again my thinking of how we can continue thinking about the past and bringing the past, or bringing those our archives from the past, from this time of the threshold, let's say, or abyss that we are in. The work that for me had a big meaning was the work by Macedonian artist Borko Lazarski, because it was displayed in the post office, main post office in Skopje, which was this 60s brutalist building. And Borko Lazarski is one of the prominent artists from history of Macedonian art. And at the beginning of in the 45, 46, he was very much, he was a partisan, and he was engaged to paint number of murals. But at the same time, this project started with him writing actually to the government, to state that actually in Yugoslavia, we would like actually to have the combination of both, to refer to Western art, to have a freedom of basically combining it with this art, which would be celebrating the partisans and which would be celebrating socialism. So therefore, in Yugoslavia, as many of you would know, we never really have this realism like it was in the rest of the Eastern Bloc, and because also I can see that this was due to also the persistence or the position of the art of that artists took by themselves. So therefore this work had a big meaning for myself and many my co-citizens. Unfortunately, in 2013 the work burned, and this is what you are basically seeing on this screen, is those big panels of the work, which is basically non-existent. So if we can go to the next slide. And basically, this is the interior of the post office hand side of the image. And what I did, we can go, if I don't know, are we stopped? Yeah. And I tried basically to, if we stop here or here, doesn't matter. I tried to repaint some of actually whole of this mural. But while I painted it, because I was painting on the big screens and looking at computer and copying and everything, I could never basically make the scale the same. So this was also for me a somehow moment when I realized that actually we cannot completely go back, just kind of like take something from the past, but we also have to somehow develop on it. So what I'm doing, I'm basically painting these panels, which are work by Borko Lazeski, but they actually never fit. And when they would be, let's say, going to replacing the original mural that disappeared, they would actually just create a certain kind of resemblance to the actual work, but also not completely. If you just play the next images, so this is one of the panels, and this is how it was exhibited in the Venice Biennial. And some, for example, this one is complete copy, while the rest is, in terms of the scale, is really scaling. And stop here. Previous one, if you can, and I will finish there. Something that we, okay. Annie, yeah, perfect. Juliette Jacques mentioned in her writing for Fries, that this is maybe one of the ways how we can address the past. And I think from my point of view, it's very, very important that we with the sensibility and with the special attention, go back to those archives and go back to that history, because in a way it is as it was, it belongs to the time when it happens, but in a way there are many ways that we can find a connection, and we can somehow find a way as creatives or as an artist or thinkers reuse or go back to the same. Sorry, I hope it did not take too much time. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Nana. This was amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. We move on to our next speaker. Let me just my computer. Lina, are you there? Yeah. Okay. So our next speaker,
yes, I am.
Dzuverovic, one of my colleagues here at Birkbeck, actually. She's currently lecturer at in Arts Management and Policy here at the Arts and English and Humanities department. And apart from her academic work, she's also an independent curator. She was the artistic director at Calvert 22, the gallery that was focusing on art from the so-called East, which now has closed, unfortunately, and the founding director of Electra, a London-based contemporary arts organization. So I'm really glad to have you here and to share your thoughts on the acting archives.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Are you able to see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Do let me know if they're not moving as I begin. So thank you very much, Magda, and also thank you to Liene and to Lou for organizing this. It's been a real pleasure to think about these questions over the past year. As you mentioned, it's a project with various delays, like so much in life at the moment. But it's been a pleasure to think about this, and also, as you mentioned at the beginning, to talk very informally and I think candidly with yourselves and Nada exactly a year ago about these questions. So I've prepared a presentation very much based around our conversation back then, or how I remember it. And I will start by sharing my slides. Okay. As I said, this talk emerges out of initial conversations with Nada Prlja and the organizers of this event in the first half of 2020 about the parallels between the anxiety brought forth by the COVID-19 pandemic and the malaise associated with the so-called end of communism in and around 1989. Or, in my case, the continued sense of loss and unease prompted by the slow death of Yugoslavia as both my home and a political proposition with many positive aspects and promising traits. So I started thinking about how can two such different life experiences bear any similarities. One, the end of a political proposition, and the other, a physical threat to our bodies. In what way precisely are they alike, and what underpins the anxiety that they both generated in some of us? Did they both, in their own ways, function as a form of Heideggerian ontological death, ushering in a sense of a breakdown, a world collapse, challenging our understanding of the world and our place within it? So I have approached this from more of a personal perspective than I usually do. And what I'm looking to do here is to map the artworks I normally work with in my research with personal experiences. So it's a bit of an experiment. So in the initial confusion, loss, fear, and uncertainty of the pandemic, without realizing, I turned to familiar experiences, moments of rupture, loss, and anxiety that I had experienced before. There is indeed a certain sense of familiarity and continuity in this malaise, an inevitable return to I am sad again, I am alone again, I am anxious again. That is always already there, a return to a familiar existential angst, which after all comes as no surprise because we always knew we would feel that way again. It is indeed a form of haunting, not by the past, but by the repeated loss of a future towards which we thought we were heading. So in this short talk, I focus on personal experience of the gradual and slow demise of the dream world, quote unquote, and I'm using the Susan Buck-Morse term, that was the proposition of Yugoslav socialism, socialism with a human face, third way socialism, non-aligned socialism, self-managed socialism, all ways in which the Yugoslav particular form of socialism is referred to. I revisit 4 key moments for me in the dissolving and reconfiguring of socialist selves. So, part 1, Tito's 2 bodies. It is 4th of May, 1980, and I'm 10 years old and attending my best friend's birthday party. My aunt comes to pick me up and tells me that Tito has died. Even prior to this moment, instinctively, I had known for some time that things were going to change, even though as a child I did not know why, nor could I name the system I was living in. Something to do with my grandfather's anger when he realized some years back that at school they had asked us to declare our ethnic origin by ticking which one of the 6 Yugoslav republics we were originally from. He went to school and complained. Tito's death. In Tito's death, Ernst Kantorovic's much theorized thesis of the king's 2 bodies is played out. We live through the inseparability of the body natural of the sovereign and the other, spiritual body, which continues to live after the leader's death in a form of legacy of their rule. an idea constructed through religious and legal traditions, producing the concept of the sovereign. Tito's communist body, named so by Bojana Pejic, amongst others, was constructed both through portraits, which were present in everyday spaces already during the national liberation struggle, and later through his symbolic presence, achieved through the symbolism of the use of his name and his signature. And here we see Tito's birthday, where the bodies of young youths in Yugoslavia are spelling the word Tito. Sorry, that was that image. In parallel with official, sorry, just adjusting to the slides. In parallel with official images of Tito, artists engaged with this omnipresent figure, mostly by invoking his absent presence, such as Braco Dimitrievic's well-known Casual Passerby series, first executed in Zagreb in 1971. By placing the subject of Yugoslav socialism, the ordinary citizen, the working subject, as Igor earlier talked about in his presentation, at the site where the leader was normally seen, Dimitrievic's work invoked Tito's absent presence, posing the question of who really mattered in Yugoslav society, the governing elites or the ordinary citizen. And this is the main square in Zagreb, where the artist has placed images of passers-by that he has taken instead of a large image of Tito. Rare, but powerful, were more explicitly critical representations of Tito, such as the long band Svečana slika, festive painting, from 1974 by Mića Popović, which critically aligned Tito's lifestyle with the opulence of European royalty. The ambivalence and critical takes on the cult of personality were highlighted during Tito's last days. During Tito's stay in hospital, which lasted 122 days, subsequently referred to as 122 Days of Hope, in what was a prefiguration of reality TV, in an effort to reassure the public that Tito really was still alive, we regularly saw Tito sipping his tea, making a telephone call, or chatting with physicians and guests at the hospital. During the 122 Days of Hope, the Zagreb-based artist Tomislav Gotovac held a series of actions, performing the same daily rituals and announcing them in the newspapers. He had, sorry, something is, there's, sorry, there, I'm getting some alert here. So Gotovac read the newspaper, he listened to the radio, he made telephone calls, he watched television, and he documented all this as a commentary on the nation's focus on its dying president. Of course, unlike Tito's, Gotovac's quotidian actions inspired no media interest whatsoever, but the very gesture of mirroring Tito's actions through the 4 performances subsequently collectively named Homage to Tito, encapsulate the state of emergency in which the entire nation was suspended, living their reality primarily through the media, probably for the first time to such an extent. Part 2. Assimilation and connecting. This is the early 90s. It is the early 90s, and the contours of the former Yugoslavia keep changing almost continuously through a series of conflicts and devastating wars. I'm now living in London, freshly graduated from art school, and in my early 20s, trying hard to get on with my life and to think positively about the future. Not because growing up in Yugoslavia was traumatic in any way, nor have I had personally directly suffered any traumatic events during this period, but because to live without Yugoslavia, which I don't realize yet, underpins and shapes my identity means to somehow begin to construct a new identity, tapping into other experiences, developing a whole new way of being. The envisaged future is also beginning to fade as the prospect of returning home seems increasingly unlikely. The displacement and the haunting at my heels is a socialist haunting, an unfulfilled and interrupted promise that without romanticizing is simply unfinished business. However, the only way to survive in capitalist soul-sucking brutality that is London at this point is to assimilate. I develop projects trying to bridge the two realities and two experiences to make sense of it. I take a program of radical performance work from the UK to Belgrade into Yugoslavia under sanctions, feeling I need to do at least something. I decide to interview my female childhood heroes in Belgrade and my friends about their situation and their present life in Belgrade. In a not yet declared feminist gesture. Together with my friend Mikhaila Rankovic, I interviewed the late Margita Stefanovic of the band Ekaterina Velika and the cult actor, the late Sonja Savic, both figures on the Belgrade New Wave Belgrade New Wave generation, the lifeblood of the city until recent days. We also interview people of our own generation. Nobody is well. People are taking a lot of drugs, finding ways to work, trying to cope. The filming is difficult. There are many impediments, but everyone is keen to discuss, to share, to process. Part 3. Foreigner. It is 2015, and I'm now living in Zagreb, where, with my Serbian accent, I'm perceived as a foreigner and frequently addressed with an assumption of a certain belonging through pop culture, football, public figures of recent years, none of which I'm familiar with. References, places, and public figures that I knew from my childhood in Belgrade have either been actively erased and replaced or forgotten through the processes of omission from textbooks, selective literature, altered historical narratives. The quote-unquote renaming machine, a term coined by Susanna Milewska to underscore the arbitrary and contingent nature of names and to examine clandestine ideological patterns of desiring renaming machine, has to an extent achieved its effect with the younger generations genuinely not knowing the history of the partisan struggle. In all this, artists like Igor Grubic, who we heard earlier, Sanja Ivejković, whose work you can see here, which deals with the renaming of streets in Zagreb, Milica Tomic and many others, repeatedly challenged the systemic erasure of socialist past, of not only names, but values, histories, knowledges. And by these efforts, but these efforts are far and few between. In a general neoliberal climate, neoliberal and nationalist climate of rushing towards a new belonging to a future populated by large malls and global brands and all the seductions of platform capitalism, these voices need to work hard to be heard. At Britanski Trg flea market, strapped in Zagreb, strapped for cash pensioners cannot get rid of socialist memorabilia fast enough, along with other bric-a-brac. A return which simultaneously brings anxiety about what comes next. I regularly buy books, journals, annuals, showcasing Yugoslav times, Tito's travels, etc. Much of my time through my PhD, I'm completely immersed in post-1945 Yugoslavia, spending all my time reading Edvard Kardelj, the architect of self-management. I read about the non-aligned movement, about the foundations of the emerging networks of student cultural centers, feeling the optimism of the times growing from the late 50s to the early 70s. When I take breaks, I get a jolt as I return to the current moment and read the news in which there are 7 countries, and I'm a foreigner in Croatia, welcome as a Brit, less so if perceived as a Serb. The strong sense of optimism and the sense of internationalism, solidarity and resistance to global capitalism is today replaced with neoliberal pressures and rapidly developed survival instincts. This is another work by Sanja Ivekovic called Lost and Found, revisiting places that still had their names from socialist times, but they're rapidly being replaced. Part 4, uncertain present, evoking uncertain pasts. This is the pandemic times and London in 2020. Still reeling from a series of continued political disappointments in a moment that continues a chain of events, Donald Trump's presidency, the seemingly never-ending Brexit negotiations, and the December 2019 election results in the UK, a looming pandemic stops us in our tracks. What Franco Bifo Berardi spoke of as the slow cancellation of the future back in 2011, and as Mark Fisher added, and the deflation of expectations, has reached a new high. The already atomized ways of living and working become even more so as everything shifts online. It does not take long to realize that the pandemic is deeply divisive between those who are privileged and able to remain isolated and those who simply have no choice but to take risks by continuing life as before despite the virus. As we watch a series of governmental missteps in handling of the pandemic, in parallel, there is also a rapid and hopeful shift towards local support, friends organizing amongst themselves, mutual aid groups. Most events I attend on Zoom are centered on notions of care. For the first time in London, since my arrival at the beginning of the 90s, I'm reminded of ways of organizing that were second nature during my childhood. People sharing information about where you could find rarely available staple goods, coffee, chocolate, particularly good meat, cashew nuts, soya. Here in London of 2020, we're sharing information about which pharmacies have masks, sanitizer, at first even toilet paper. We're doing each other's grocery shopping. At times of crisis and uncertainty, the instinct is to return to a place of safety. My initial instinct was to, quote unquote, go home. And home is not a place, it is Yugoslav socialism. As it happens, the early days of the pandemic coincide with 40 years of Tito's death, and I return to the work, Days of Pride and Sorrow, by Goranka Matic, a series of photographs taken immediately after Tito's death as a form of an archive of those feelings. The series documents shop windows in the center of Belgrade immediately after Tito's death on the 4th of May 1980, showing the agency of the individual in paying tribute. In Days of Pride and Sorrow, the mundane and the ceremonial coexist. The collective starts to emerge across all these vastly different businesses. In the work, we see how these individual shops are continuing their normal trade, while also in many cases quite awkwardly acknowledging the collective event that has just taken place. In many cases, we see bizarre combinations of objects for sale in the windows, football kits, shoes, cosmetic products, hairdressers products, which are combined with images of mourning, often making for quite surreal but sometimes even comical displays. The work's sense of being on the brink of change feels a little like the early days of the pandemic and the first lockdown. The sense of normal life grinding to a halt, the sense of a collective concern and uncertainty, and to an extent shock. I'm reminded of the strangeness of trying to continue as normal life while living with the knowledge that life is profoundly altered. In such a situation, everything becomes strange. The simplest actions and events in life are rethought, and there's a sense of collective slowing down. Regardless of my whereabouts, within Yugoslav territory or not, the ghost of Yugoslav socialism seems present, not as a form of nostalgia, but a sense of the unfinished, unrealized potentialities which continuously call out for a revisiting, a better understanding, unfinished business. Like all ghosts, this sense cannot be grasped. This haunting exists in just momentary glimpses of hope, a glimpse of other possibilities, such as simple gestures of solidarity felt during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, Lina. Thank you. I mean, I recognize some bits of it, but thank you for sharing even more of the story.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, have I stopped presenting?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so we're coming to our last speaker for today. So I'm really grateful to be able to introduce Lina Ozolina, who is currently an assistant professor at the Latvian Academy of Culture. I'm not sharing my video. Let's show myself again. And yeah, so when we met first, you were still based here at the LSE, but during the pandemic, actually, you moved back home. So, and the home is also part of, home is a concept that is in your title. So it's again a link to the experience we've been going through. But yeah, let me also just mention that you're the author of the book Politics of Waiting, Workforce, Post-Soviet Austerity and the Ethics of Freedom. And yeah, you've been the co-organizer of this event and a very important companion throughout the whole year. So yeah, hand over to you and give you the
Thank you, Magda. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I won't be sharing any slides. I'll just be sharing some brief, still emerging, forming thoughts on the theme of communist hauntings. So when Magda invited me to help her organize an event on the theme of communist hauntings, we were, like she just said, both living in London still at the time, had just completed our PhDs there. And as Magda explained at the time, the idea of the project was to explore the memories, the archives of the socialist past in Eastern Europe, and how those can be used by artists, cultural theorists, social scientists, to critically examine at the time what we were thinking about as the crisis of liberal democracy in Europe. So the idea, as I understood it, at least one aspect of it, was to explore the potential of these East European socialist, communist historical memories, the historical entanglements with the socialist ideas of social security, social justice, solidarity, explore those in and for the neoliberal societies of today to serve as a source of critique of contemporary neoliberal democracy, both in the East and in the West. When we met in autumn of 2019 to discuss this, I had just returned from a short fieldwork trip to Riga, where I am now. My son was at the time just over 1 year old, and he traveled with me to Riga. And so did my mother to help care for him while I was doing some interviews. And we all stayed in an Airbnb apartment near the city center. And when Magda spoke of communist hauntings in our first meeting, my first thought was, in fact, sort of a memory, was of this ramp that was laid over the rather steep stairs, providing access from the street to that building in Riga where our Airbnb apartment had been. The only way to get the baby pram inside the building was by using this ramp. But the ramp was built so steep and narrow that every time it seemed like a dangerous exercise to push the pram up, and even more precarious to move it down over the stairs. So I was just about strong enough to do it, though it didn't feel safe, but my mother couldn't do it at all. So I had to replan my fieldwork so that we would always exit and enter the building together, all three of us. And so my mother would take my son in the pram for a walk while I would run and do a quick interview, and it would have to be short enough so that I'd be back in time for us to go back in the building together. And sometimes when I was held up, my mother would ask a passerby for help, but that was 2 weeks that we're juggling it that way. And for my mother, who was born in the Soviet Latvia of 1951, this ramp appeared as a communist ghost in the contemporary democratic, quote-unquote, European present, as we often refer to it in Latvia, being in Europe now. As we lamented the absurd construction of that ramp, she said it exposed the Soviet thinking, the Soviet attitude living on in Latvian society. In fact, the ramp looked like it was built rather recently, certainly in the post-Soviet years, but it was, I guess, the lack of regard for the individual and the formal nature of fulfilling a legal requirement for buildings to be accessible, with the reality being very different, that my mother identified as Soviet. So we're seemingly in Europe, supposedly caring equally for all kinds of people, including those in wheelchairs and in prams, but de facto the communist past, as she saw it, is haunting us in this disregard for the individual, in this inhumanity of the structures holding us, or literally not holding, almost making us fall, the structures providing the shape to our life. The carelessness in the way that a space is set up. So those were the communist ghosts for her, saying something about how that past is carried in the Latvian society today. So there was this intriguing tension for me in this project from the start. On the one hand, the obvious to me need for an alternative language to think about what it means to live in a European democracy today, alternative language to the one that governs the politics and the public sphere, certainly in Latvia. An alternative language to think freedom or solidarity or social justice, given that the lived realities of the neoliberal democracy entail increasing insecurity, socioeconomic precariousness, mental anguish caused by poverty and insecurity. And I had grown up in such an anguished environment. I have studied it as a sociologist, doing field work at an unemployment office in Riga in the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis and so forth. So as a sociologist, I recognize the need for a greater emphasis on solidarity, social justice, equality, which is one potential from one service of these communist ghosts, as I understand it. Yet on the other hand, as this little ethnographic vignette with this Airbnb apartment and this ramp in Riga exemplifies, the particular embodied experiences, the particular memories living in the family, the particular hauntings circulated in my case in the Latvian public discourse, give a particular twist to the ideas associated with communism, with socialism. So the communist archive is in a way not available in the same way, I think, to me, available to think the same way in the Baltics as it is, say, in the case of former Yugoslavia. And I cannot claim I've worked this tension out, and maybe that's not at all the goal, but I'm hoping at this point that this contradiction, one I feel very personally, can be a useful place from which to contribute to this project. And that's what I'm exploring right now. And then, yes, since the start of the project, of course, the pandemic broke out. And as other speakers have already pointed to, there have been some curious post-communist hauntings in the current COVID-19 crisis, like the reinvoking of the idea of solidarity, but also that sense of a loss of a future, profound uncertainty tying together 2020 and the period around 1990. So, and since the conception of this project, I've moved from London to Riga. I'm one of the, in a sense, of the so-called Brexit refugees who've led back to the mainland back home. And I don't know if this is a coincidence or not, but like Magda also said, the home is in the title of my talk, taking concepts home. So what interests me is asking what these concepts that we evoke in exercises of critical examination, such as this project, such as this event today, solidarity, loss, future. So what these concepts actually have in common, to what extent they are universal. So to what extent we're having a conversation about something in common, and in what ways they are actually differently available to us, to me. And I'm thinking here of Chakrabarty's book, Provincializing Europe, where he talks about how thought and place are closely tied, or similarly, Lina Das's thesis in her latest book, Textures of the Ordinary, where she speaks about the necessity to lead the words back to the everyday, concepts being part of life, She argues we need to lead words back from the metaphysical to the ordinary. And we might say that what is, I'm quoting here, what is at stake is not simply the meaning of a word, but what gives words life. So taking solidarity as an example, solidarity became one of the words invoked often in the context of the pandemic. The way the pandemic has exposed our vulnerability as humans due to the excessive exploitation of nature has made sociologists, other scholars, but also politicians, artists call for this renewed sense of solidarity. We have the EU Solidarity Fund. We have, yes, famous sociologists talking about solidarity. Of course, this concept that comes from kind of the early days of sociology already is now having some kind of particular relevance and renewed life, or also these sort of small acts of neighborhood solidarities that that Lina was just talking about, helping one another with medicine prescriptions, like on our street in London when I was still there, or doing groceries. And in the context of this project, I'm thinking of these rich histories of this notion of solidarity in Eastern Europe, especially, and what those can teach us. So, like in Nada's work, in Nada's project Subversion to Red, that she briefly spoke about today as well, some of these histories of solidarity are explored in the case of former Yugoslavia. And as I read it, this Subversion to Red project seeks to revive the particular language or some parts of it, this discourse of justice, equality, solidarity, while at the same time rejecting the state party bureaucratic project that state socialism was. And as the project description, Nada's Subversion to Red, as I was reading more about it, it invokes Alain Bourdieu's idea of world as one of the universal. This was, of course, the socialist proposal, the uniting of all the oppressed, all the marginalized. That's what Bourdieu is also speaking to, and sort of these performances around the red table are exploring. But I also think that these East European perspectives that we're bringing here together are also giving us tools to subvert, in that same spirit of Nada's work in a way, to subvert this idea of universality, or to really kind of explore what that language is, or where the homes of those concepts are. And so that made me think of two particular episodes from the Latvian history, two particular instances of solidarity building and future building that in a way take these concepts home for me in a particular way. So the first episode goes back to January 1991. So in 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing and the Latvian independence movement had managed to declare their national independence a year earlier, in 91, the Soviet leaders were attempting one last time to regain control, and a couple of days earlier in the months of January, Soviet tanks had rolled into Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital. And this prompted the Latvians to build these barricades around key buildings in Riga to resist the Soviet forces. So there was no army. It was just citizens, ordinary people, including many farmers who came with heavy agricultural machinery, tractors, other heavy equipment to block access to key buildings like the radio, the television, the government. Block access to potentially Soviet tanks arriving, and bonfires were lit as people tried to keep warm. And it was apparently both ethnic Latvians and ethnic Russians that were coming together on the barricades, that were feeling this particular kind of solidarity, unity as the people on the barricades. Russian women, just like Latvian women, bringing food to the men sitting on the barricades for these long days and nights. And so this episode has this huge resonance in Latvia still, this barricades episode. And anthropologists, Latvian anthropologist Dace Zanauska, together with a colleague Ivan Arenas, have written about barricade episodes in Latvia and in Mexico, comparing them, and they're speaking about this, analyzing this revolutionary subject, the people at this time as united against power, against the totalitarian power. And yet later this particular bond, this solidarity, quickly So already at that moment, it being kind of on the in some ways this kind of universal sense of solidarity, what participants were referring to as kind of cosmic energy being shared, cosmic energy being in Riga at the time. And at the same time, these immediate sort of carvings into different identity groups, of course, Latvians, Russians, that then solidified pretty much immediately right after. But also then later, the identity politics, say with the moral majority, Latvians, and then say like sexual minorities, LGBT community in Latvia, these constant sort of over years clashes between the moral majority and the others. So the universal and the national, the nationalistic. And in the current pandemic, the Latvian intellectuals, politicians, artists have all been invoking the solidarity that we need now in this crisis, in this pandemic, like the one experienced on the barricades. So this image from the past has been that of the barricade sociality, yet it's mostly been recalled as a national solidarity, a unity of a nation, a folk rising up against an oppressive power. So at the same time, though, the barricade, actual barricade memories from the members testify this possibility of a more of what some of the participants were calling this cosmic energy, uniting the humans, surpassing all divisions. So, and it was, as these anthropologists, Zenoska and Arenas argue, also due to the specific material practices, rather than some ideas, some sort of political ideals or concepts. It was the specific material practices, like setting up the tank traps, lighting bonfires, or cooking, that this kind of bodily and physical coming together on those streets that had that potential to create this more universal kind of a feeling of power and togetherness. So one thing that this example suggests is that we can think of solidarity as these specific practices that are nonetheless already always usually kind of historically, culturally specific, so often closely connected to ideas and understandings of belonging, of place, of land, and of nation. And I wonder what that tells us about how solidarity works. The second episode that I want to briefly discuss, that also somehow came to me in these reflections, was of the 1970s in Latvia, and a group of artists and writers who set up an initiative at the time called the Great Tree Liberation Group. So the Great Tree Liberation Group. And the aim was to organize trips to the countryside in order to find and help preserve large old trees, mostly oak trees, but also others, and to protect them from the undergrowth. As the Soviet agricultural industrialization policy had meant very collective housing, collective working on the land, and many farmsteads where often these kind of solitary, very old trees would grow, had been abandoned. And Katrina Schwartz, an anthropologist who has explored this group, this movement in detail, she writes, if these huge old trees accustomed to growing in open spaces were not freed from the encroachments of undergrowth, they would not only lose their aesthetic value, but were likely to die sooner and more gravely. Great trees were being destroyed by these land reclamation brigades. So sort of draining the fields for agriculture and just kind of mowing those trees down. So of course, this movement of liberating the trees was a symbolic one. It was a way of protecting the landscape. It was also in a way of protecting the community, protecting really the nation, and and yet expressed and practiced in very particular terms, as Iman Ziedonis, the poet who founded the group, wrote in the 80s. It may seem, he wrote, as if we're tending the environment, but it seems to us that the most important thing today is to tend oneself, and the very idea of tending. And another participant, another poet who participated in this tree liberation group, wrote in the 80s, this is a time of stagnation, a time stuck in its own abyss, in a societal decline. And here an alternative society is being created in this group. And that's one that takes off to the nature, one that disappears in trees. She's using a playful language here. So it was through these particular quite mundane practices of cutting bushes, clearing the space around the trees, through these forms of manual labor, that a possibility of a future was tended to, and that a feeling of a sense of community was quietly maintained. And in a way, I think it was the absence of that kind of tending and that kind of care for the place and the space that my mother was reacting to when trying to use that ramp, that lack of tending that is somehow associated with the socialist past. So as we continue to look for resources in the socialist archive to envision alternative futures, we need to recognize this rooted, embodied, particular nature of these concepts. As soon as we think of solidarity or a dream of a future as particular acts or instances rather than as universals, they turn out to be tied to particular places, particular cultural imaginaries, and particular histories. Simone Weil, in her book, The Need for Roots, writes that future can give us nothing. It is us that have to give ourselves to that future to make something of it. And to give something, we need to be rooted. We need the past to draw on. So connection with the past as crucial. And she explores this sort of tension, this tension that on the one hand, it is often, if not always in the modern societies, the nation state that ensures our connection to our past. Yet the nation state is also, as she writes, a collectivity that can both that can devour us. So it can both feed and devour us, which is something I'm finding evocative in this context. So to point also to link it to a point in the previous session, also Francisco's point about these methodological excavations of socialism, post-socialism, looking for these alternative epistemological approaches. The particular East European archives, genealogies, histories, and presence of solidarity, of future visions, of imaginations of freedom can serve us as a way to take these European universal concepts home, like concepts of freedom, solidarity, nation state. And so if the idea of the workshop has been to explore the content and the potential critical value of communist hauntings, that I'm finding it important, and I hope it's been useful to think of examining as a closing contribution for today, how the ideas that haunt are in fact particularly rooted, embodied, rather than universal or abstract, and thus to further explore these quite uneasy ideas around rootedness, around belonging, around ultimately nationalism, ideas that don't necessarily sit easily alongside the universalist notions of social justice and social solidarity that the socialist tradition contains, and yet that keep cropping up, to use this another biological metaphor. So through such an exercise, through tracing some of these connections between thought and place, we can discover the rootedness of both our concepts, as well as, at least if I'm thinking through my own experiences, my own thinking, as well as of our political subjectivities. Thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Liene, for this for this summarizing thoughts, and also like reaching out to the beginning of the beginning of the project, which kind of seems so far away. Like on all these panels, we don't have much time, but I will just try to maybe kind of facilitate like one last section of thinking together, and then see if anyone from the audience has another question, or also I would like to encourage the audience now, if you have a question, maybe formulate it already and put it in the chat, or raise your hand. But before we see whether this will happen, I just, when listening to all your, the presentations of the last panel, I was struck how kind of our focus kind of moved from time, even though time was there all the time, obviously, the past, future, and the present, and how they kind of come up, as another said, in this threshold in very different ways, but also like how space became much more of a theme, and also how our particular individual bodies kind of relate to this space, and depending on where we are and what happens to the conditions around us, certain memories come up. So this was one thought, and the other element, which I think I take from this panel, is just starting with Liene's last thoughts, but it's linked to what Lina and Nada also said, is how a certain process of mourning, of kind of a confrontation with certain losses, has been disrupted or not allowed, and has instead been replaced by a certain jargon or narrative of concepts of how we should think about the past and the present, and that there is some form of kind of stagnation or frozenness of certain experiences that were forming in the context of the socialist structure, which were very ambiguous. And I think this panel has shown this very well, like depending on in which place and which time, socialism is associated with very different contradicting feelings and memories. But nevertheless, which kind of memories it is still a remembering that was suddenly kind of interrupted. There was no space or no time created for going through the process of loss or healing after certain traumatic experiences or traumatic losses. And how, interestingly, the threshold that came up in the pandemic kind of paradoxically maybe allowed to some of these emotions, some of these experienced concepts or ideas to re-emerge in very small situations, even though we mostly were sitting at home. But it was, some of these elements came much more to life. So that was something I really allowed me to think, like the way how you presented your thoughts. And then maybe to finish with a question, I don't know, is whether each of you, like, based on what we've talked, can maybe speculate or play with this idea of creating this home in this threshold place, like not having to kind of now move away from it or close it, because we know it's not going to be it's going to be, if we allow ourselves to be in the threshold and maybe to re-explore certain experiences in order to mourn, but also be able to imagine new things in different ways, then we maybe have to admit that we will be in this threshold, neither being able to go to the past home, nor will we find the new home straight away, but we will dwell in this place. And so how could we imagine this home so that we can do all these things, recycling, revisiting, playing with kind of fractured experiences and concepts that we struggle to revive or live with?
I mean, my initial response would be that we already do. That's precisely what we are doing now, and we all do it through our individual work. We're returning to things that kept us engaged and kept us thinking about them and working with them, continuing to work with them. I mean, Nada's been doing it obviously with different concepts from socialism. We're all doing it through kind of finding ways of revisiting those experiences from today. So it's kind of adding it to the experience of today, and then constantly going back to, in a way, test out how they feel now. So I think this, I strongly feel that is already happening.
Thank you. Anyone else? I also see that Elena has a question, but let's maybe first see whether you want to contribute. Any of the other speakers would like to speak to them?
I mean, I can just add very shortly. I very much liked when Lina said there is no place where to return, and I think that's what we are all living through, and somehow I mean, it would be from the creative point of view, from point of view being an artist. I think that's in a way something that at the same time is inspired. It's stupid to say inspiring, but it's something that somehow it would be no art if there is no places like that. There are no kind of places of rapture and so on. So somehow I think art insert within that, but at the same time we can, I mean, whatever somehow however we contribute, that still there is that haunt us. There is no place where to somehow return, and so it's a quite complex, but at the same time, I mean, quite beautifully formulated, but by all of you, and it's a yeah. So somehow it's at the same time a positive and negative experience. So they kind of share the place. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you, Liene.
Yeah, just briefly, I thought, Magda, you put it very aptly about this sort of the absence, or the kind of no space and time, somehow, that there was the sort of change of the systems with mourning and processing, and indeed somehow something in this pandemic, perhaps particularly, especially for me, because I have returned, right, is kind of now coming up and making process. And I mean, I'm also just I agree with what Lina and Nada said as well, that we're kind of, I think, are processing it in our work, and that's why I feel like in my case as well, the work is necessarily extremely personal, because it's these very it's very personal memories and experiences that are kind of haunting me and coming up and attacking, and need to be somehow worked through. But it is through that you can understand, like, that I'm at the same time feeling like I can maybe understand something about, so how does it work, like this this paradox, this contradiction that about that this nationalism constantly sort of messing with with the ideas around like the whole sort of everyone, of course, being exasperated and barely surviving the kind of double, triple neoliberal crisis present, and yet always kind of just like we keep returning back to the same thing. And so why is that? And what are these particular sort of roots that are holding us in particular places? And so I'm just trying to work it through these very kind of personal experiences.
Thank you. And how much we should value them. Yeah. Elena, you have another question.
Yeah, I thank you very much. It's been a wonderful panel to hear and kind of try to think with you guys. And it's not much of a question, it's much more some reflections. I come to this from an anarchist perspective rather than a communist perspective, so I apologize in advance. So I was as I was listening to all the papers, I was thinking that there's no, the way that you're reading communism or socialism, it's not sort of as an ideology, right? You kind of brought to us the relics of the ideology in your archives, but the talks were about kind of new, for the lack of a better word, new sort of iterations of communism. Either, I think, Nada, you talked, I loved your I was going to say, it's not cartoon, but your drawings, and you talked about the sort of extinction, I guess, kind of the ecological extinction. So I thought, oh, and Lina talked about sort of mutual practices that kind of emerge of support and solidarity during the pandemic. But you could also link them back to mourning, sort of Tito's loss, or etc. So and Liane, your example with the ramp and the resistance to the individual. I thought it was quite interesting as well. So I was wondering whether if we are to talk, I was thinking the whole panel should be about dreaming communism anew. You know, I thought that captured all of your papers. So I was wondering whether a way forward is to identify what practices actually that are there in socialist communist ideas rather than ideologies can help us to save ourselves from this neoliberal logic that we all find ourselves in. So that's kind of my comment, not question.
Thank you so much for this, Elena. I also love this title that you've given to the panel, the Dreaming Communism Anew. I think it obviously links also to some of the concept that's been used, so like images, but also it kind of replaces a bit the haunting, the spooky way of the hauntedness, which obviously is there. And dreams can be very spooky and uncanny as well, but it captures more the hopefulness that is still lying around, scattered somehow, hidden underneath various experiences. We still have to find out what they actually did to us. Yeah. Is there any other question or any other comment from the panelists?
Thank you, Elena, for that. I wanted to say, just in response, again, just to point back to Nada's work. I think I'm not only just saying this because you're here, Nada, but the work Subversion to Red, that is exactly what it does. It sort of revitalizes concepts. I mean, probably in other works too, but that's what to me is very strong about the work, is that it's not in any way nostalgic, and it's not in any way kind of inviting us to remember how things were in their sort of static form, but it's asking current thinkers who are coming from many different perspectives to take these concepts and in a way get rid of the baggage and say, well, what does this mean today? And that, to me, that's why A, it's a strong work, and B, it points to something that we could maybe use as a strategy or use as a model in other ways, to kind of think, well, how can we empty these concepts of all the heavy meanings that they're filled with and revitalize them. So it's just one example, but I'm sure other work does that as well.
Yeah. Nada, you want to say something on that?
No, I mean, yes, absolutely. I agree very much with Lina, and that was the intention of the work, because in a way, and I think it is a reaction to a fact that we sometimes, I mean, coming from ex-Yugoslavia, are perceived that we are just nostalgic toward that time that does not exist, that place which is we cannot return to, but it's a very far away from the nostalgic desire. There is nothing that I would say, oh, I would love to have this chocolate or something from the time of Yugoslavia. No, it is very much opposite. It really is about how we can use something that had a value and somehow build on it. And as Lina said, so there is no kind of I mean, even though we talked very personally, let's say today, in a very subtle way and a very feminine way about our memories and about how we feel today, but at the same time, in that work, what is important is basically, and through rest of my practice, is somehow to rethink about certain aspects without being just simply nostalgic about them. And in terms of the ideology, there is no desire to go back to the same ideology. But at the same time, I think through this project, it also asks, do we need ideology? Because I think with this neoliberalism, capitalism, we have ignored ideology. So what would be this maybe new ideology, because, for example, if you think about solidarity, that's something that this work red discussion is talking a lot about, and this is one of the things that, for example, I would think this is the positive one, but how we can find a way to revive that, and I think we needed that very much during this pandemic, for example. So I'm not per se against ideology. I'm not for this socialist ideology in the way as it was, but I am also for something that we need to believe in, like, let's say, a solidarity, for example, so that we can be together and help one another and support and so on and so on. So yeah, if I answered that, yes.
Yeah, thank you. There's one more question from Bojana.
Hello, thank you all for a wonderful panel. I think it's a very important one to discuss these kinds of issues. I had perhaps a comment, or I don't know if it's or a question to the panel, and it has to do with this idea of nostalgia. I find it really problematic the ways in which nostalgia is sort of relegated to this kind of negative formulation that often we hear with so-called post-socialism. And I really do believe that there is something very politically potent in nostalgia. Unfortunately, we all sort of cling on to these literary notions that were created in the 90s, just as the Soviet or the Eastern Bloc has collapsed. But there's something very important to think about nostalgia as a political and active term, and rather than something that is, always negative. So that would be one thing, and perhaps you can talk about it, since I feel that in some of your presentations there is that potential. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about wanted to touch on is this idea of, the past and socialism, at least in Yugoslavia, as being stagnant. In fact, socialism in Yugoslavia was extremely dynamic, both politically, culturally, and economically. And throughout the 45 years, unfortunately, only 45 years of its existence, Yugoslav state, its actors, meaning state actors, have continuously rethought the system. They've experimented. So Yugoslavia, in a way, was an experiment with socialism, and a very dynamic one, that was unfortunately stopped in its tracks in the 1990s. So I want to also, think about it not as a stagnant, as a kind of a static thing, but as a dynamic thing, and how we can continue that dynamism now, and how we can rethink how we think and talk about this history. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much. So very good questions. Would like to say something on that?
I can respond very briefly. Hi, Bojana. Nice to see you. Well, hear you.
Nice to hear you too.
Yeah. I mean, on nostalgia, I think that's a really important point. I feel like nostalgia, Yugo-nostalgia, this term Yugo-nostalgia has become a sort of a stick to beat anyone working with this area with. So it's immediately, to me, it's associated with shame, because there's a certain level of kind of embarrassment, or at least I feel like that you're sort of letting your emotions take over, that there's a sense of affect there, that you're kind of, that there is, with nostalgia comes a sense of loss, a sense of feeling that times were better, and also a sense of kind of emotional connection. And at least in my work, my curatorial work, I've often kind of almost self-censored in a way when writing, when thinking about work, and kind of put aside the emotional side. So for example, with music, I've worked a lot with music, and you kind of think, oh, am I just being really emotional because I listened to this as a teenager? Well, no, there's a lot of potential, and there's a lot of the, as you say, dynamism in these works, whether it's music or whether it's visual art. But kind of nostalgia is sort of the embarrassing side of it, and I've often felt that that's kind of the biggest insult if you're curating or writing about this work. Oh, you're being a Yugo nostalgic, and I think you're absolutely right to make a point of reclaiming it and saying, well, there's actually something potent in that. There was something powerful in this. That's why we're all working on it. That's why we return to it. That's why we find it energizing. And I think that's a really, really good point. And on the dynamism of Yugoslav socialism, yeah, I completely agree. And that's where I repeatedly return to this idea of unfinished business, in that it continued to change, but then it stopped, but it didn't stop, because the potentialities and the ideas are still there.
I can also maybe answer. I mean, I won't talk about nostalgia because I already, I think, talked about that a lot before. But I think that about the idea of this constant changing or experimenting, and the active kind of a political and cultural scene of ex-Yugoslavia, and I would very much agree with that, and through every research I did, I was really facing that even I mentioned to you that letter by this artist who was in 45, saying that we have to kind of balance between this, what it is happening at the moment with arts, and we cannot just, you know, glorify partisans endeavors and then fights, and in a way, for example, also some of the works, the more newer work, I'm referring to the museum collections of ex-Yugoslavia and the work of artists from those period, 60s and 70s, and in a way, it's just so much to be discovered, that at the same time there is so much experimentation going on, and in a way there is a very much a balance, and there is between the different potentials, and there is basically no interference with the work of artists. So in a way, I find that so important, but because that in a way shows that the system was open for that. So and somehow it's just so important that, I mean, now we see so much happening, and we are referring back to those museums of ex-Yugoslavia and so on, and collections, and in a way, it's still too much to be. It's a lot to be discovered, and I'm super, in a way, positive and happy that something like that is happening. So, completely agree with your points. Thank you for that.
Yeah, just to briefly respond. I mean, I agree absolutely. To be nostalgic, it's absolutely political, in the sense that you are thinking of an alternative, of a different kind of possible society order. I mean, that's exactly why, you know, how the absence or the impossibility of nostalgia largely in Latvia is so linked to the absolute sort of stuckness in and these, you know, never ending, it seems, waves of neoliberal restructuring that are going on in the Baltics. You know, it's linked to the unavailability of nostalgia here. It's, you know, there's no kind of nostalgia or Yugo nostalgia going on, or even, you know, criticized or talked about. Like it's a very different kind of public discourse, which only makes the maneuvers more difficult to find, because it's you know, it's very much that there is no alternative kind of feeling.
Thank you for these responses. And yeah, it also makes me think of like what we were exploring before, that there was suddenly like what Lina said, the nostalgic feelings, it's automatically linked to feelings, but this is exactly what is somehow not allowed to have an emotional, and therefore also maybe a more undefined and unclear relation to this past. It has to be clear. There's somehow a certain imperative, and and I think like this panel was very much an example of how we can maybe find ways of liberating ourselves from this imperative and speaking differently about it, and feeling also these concepts in different ways reemerge. Okay, I think this is the end of our day, and I see lots of thank you messages, and I thank you for all these nice messages and feedbacks, and for being with us here on a Friday afternoon. So I hope you take some good new thoughts from this encounter, and I'm so honored. I feel so honored that we were able to do this together, and I see you all hopefully somehow soon. Hopefully with a glass of wine or some food around us. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank